Shall we dive in? Did you know that odds are very, very, very good that you will end up in a toxic workplace? If you haven't already, in fact. I was curious about this fact, and so I, did what everybody does these days. I did a quick search on ChatGPT, all right? I feel like ChatGPT is the new Wikipedia. You shouldn't ever use it for actual information, but we all do it anyway, right? And it cited a number of articles that found that 45% of workers quit their jobs because of a toxic work culture. Here's some more startling stats. 65% of workers feel burned out from their jobs on a weekly basis because they're overworked and overwhelmed. And only 43.6% of people have a positive outlook on their work. That means over half of you here hate your jobs, statistically, okay? And only 31% of American workers are actually engaged with their work. Like, they love what they do, and they show up and they do it. All around, a large amount of people are dissatisfied with their jobs. And here's some other reasons why. Perhaps it's because their workplace has poor management and leadership. It's just really chaotic and they don't have good culture there. Maybe they encourage poor work-life balance, so you're working way more than you are resting. Maybe people don't get enough adequate recognition and praise for the work that you're actually doing. Maybe there's some discriminatory practices here at some workplaces. Maybe you feel like you've reached your capacity at that job and there's no other spot for you higher up on the corporate ladder. So what's the point of even showing up if you can't grow out of that position? I'm just curious, how many of us here have ever worked a soul-sucking job before? Look at that! I say that's right around the 50% mark, half of us. But here's the deal. Whether you've worked for a soul-sucking job or students, maybe you haven't worked yet, chances are very good you might wind up there even after you graduate. It's a really sad reality. We all dream of working. But here's the thing, though. If you go back to those toxic workplaces, those soul-sucking jobs, very rarely is it because of the job that you're doing. It's often because of the people who are there, right? It's the people you're working with. It's not what you do, it's who you're working with. In other words, toxic workplaces are not due to a job problem, but a people problem. Right? It's not the job that's requiring you to work extra hours, it's the people who are forcing you to work beyond your limits. Right? It's not the job that's practicing discriminatory practices, it's the people who are. It's not the job that's negative, it's the people who create the culture that is negative. And so, here's kind of the mind-boggling reality for me. So if showing up to a toxic workplace, is a downer for you and it thwarts your work skills and your leadership capacity, what do you think working in those environments does to your soul and to your faith and your belief in God, right? Especially when that's where we spend the majority of our time, or at least will, if you still have to enter the workplace in the future. Because when it's viewed that way, going to work in these environments could almost feel like entering an exile every single day when you clock in. So it begs the question, how can we have a faith that thrives in an exilic work environment? That is what we are talking today as we dive into week 2 of our current series called Faith in Exile. Exile is a regularly occurring theme throughout the Old Testament scriptures, especially, okay? Mainly, it occurs in the Old Testament when God continually threatens that if his people do not turn away from their sinful living and their abhorrent practices, that he will exile them into the land of Babylon. And that's essentially what happens. But there's also a bunch of other stories of mini exiles, characters who are constantly being thrust into environments where they are leaving their comfy, cozy season of life that they were previously in and thrust into the unknown, surrounded by people and a culture that is at odds with their faith, that is at odds with their beliefs. And how do you possibly have a faith that can thrive in those environments? So that's what we're looking at in this series. Because with it being September in Vermilion, there are a number of us who are navigating these life transitions, right? The most obvious being if you're a freshman or a transfer or a graduate student starting off here. You're in an entirely new land with entirely new people. And that's why, as exciting as a transition to a new place can be, it can kind of feel like an exile. because you have no clue who you're with. You have no clue how you're going to navigate this, right? But these seasons of transition will always feel like an exile because you're eventually, for a lot of us, when we graduate, that's exciting, but that can feel like an exile. When you get a new job, that's exciting, but it can also feel like an exile. Say you lose a loved one, right? That's not exciting. But also you're navigating unknown territory with this life without that person involved in your life anymore, right? Or any unforeseen circumstance where you're just going at life normally and then it disrupts your normal every day and you're thrust into a whole new season of navigating not just how to move forward, but how good God is in the midst of this transition. It feels like an exile. So that's why this series is so important for us right now. How can we have a faith in God that can thrive even in the midst of exile? So we're looking at a number of different stories of people who do just that. Last week we talked about, what are their names? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and the importance of finding community in exile. If you haven't listened to that yet, or you need to catch up, if you scan the QR code, it brings you to those links. You can find our podcast. Subscribe, give us a thumbs up, all the YouTuber things, so that way you can never miss a beat and you always have those podcast episodes that you can catch up later. But today, we're going to explore this question. How can we be good workers in exile? And how can we have a faith that thrives in an exilic work environment? How can we be good workers in exile? Because like I said, perhaps we feel the most in exile when we go to class or when we go to work or when we stay at home, right? What does this look like? So if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn with me to Genesis chapter 37 in the New Living Translation. We're going to be looking at probably one of the best characters to navigate this topic. If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand, and Kanan's going to come around with Bibles, and you can read from this one, or if you need a Bible, then you can keep it too. So if you need a Bible, raise your hand, and they will pass those out. Awesome. Keep your hands nice and high, nice and high. Look at all those hands. Yes, they'll come and deliver those there. So as you're turning to Genesis 37, the New Living Translation, let me give you some background to this guy named Joseph. We're first introduced to Joseph as the favorite child out of Jacob's 12 sons. And Jacob, who's otherwise known as Israel, he is the patriarch of God's people, the Israelites. So right off the bat, we have a problem here. I've read the Parenting 101 books, Parenting 101 says, you don't play favorites with your children, right? So this family is already off to a really bad start considering that Jacob has a favorite son of his 12 sons. And Joseph really leans into that. He's the classic younger brother who always reported all the naughty things that his brothers were getting into, and so that just was further reason for his brothers to hate him, right? He's the favorite child, constantly telling on us, as they typically do of younger brothers. But Joseph apparently doesn't pick up on that notion. And when he's at the age of 17, he gets some dreams, essentially, about how he is better than his brothers. And I think he kind of rubs it in their faces a little bit. All right, so let's pick up Genesis 37, beginning in verse 5. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Classic. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. And suddenly my bundle stood up and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Can you just picture him rubbing that in their faces, right? And his brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. And then Joseph has another dream depicting essentially the same thing. Joseph will come to power and reign over his brothers somehow. Okay, so I'm really curious. How many of us here have younger siblings? Show of hands. All right, I'm included in that. Anybody here who is the youngest sibling? All right, okay. Younger siblings, on one hand, I apologize for the life you've lived, but also you probably deserved it. There's kind of this relationship where you have the younger sibling who's just kind of they got to fight their way, to still try to live up with their brothers and sisters, right? And therefore, the older siblings often have to really put the younger brother in their place, okay? Well, I really hope you didn't do what Joseph's brothers did to him, all right? Here's how his brothers responded to this whole situation. They decided to throw Joseph into a dried up cistern and planned to leave him there to die. But they realized, that's a little extreme. So what they did instead was they sold him to a caravan of slave traders heading to Egypt. And then they created a cover story where they took his beautiful robe of many colors that his father gave him, kind of as that item, you're my favorite child, here's this robe. They ripped it to shreds, covered it in goat's blood, and presented it to Jacob, saying, a wild animal mauled your favorite son, and he's dead. That's a little better, I guess. That's so screwed up, right? But in short, Joseph was exiled. He was exiled, and he was sent off to a foreign land in Egypt where he was sold into slavery. And it just seems like everything about his life was stripped away. And he might even wonder, where is this plan that God has for me of being able to reign over this land? What's going on with that? Well, little did he know that perhaps this exile was the best thing that could have happened to him. And maybe even the ancient world. So flip over to Genesis chapter 39. Let's start in verse 1 and see how this story continues. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Okay, so imagine being Joseph here. Put yourself in his shoes for a second, all right? You were just betrayed by your brothers, ushered off to Egypt, thousands of miles from your homeland, where no one there speaks your language, knows your heritage, nor worships your God, and you're sold into slavery. Talk about a toxic work environment, right? Let alone in exile. How could you possibly stay engaged in this job? The only way how you could stay engaged is because the alternative to not would be being flogged, imprisoned, and maybe even put to death. Right? And I would just be so mad at God if I were in Joseph's shoes. I'd be so ticked off. I would feel betrayed. I'd probably be depressed. I would just sulk in my mood, and I would just do the bare minimum to get the job done and just move on through my day. That's how I would work. I don't know how you would navigate that situation, but that's how I would do it. But how does Joseph handle this situation? Well, let's continue on in verses 2 through 6. Let's see what happens. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. So, I don't know how toxic of a work environment you might be in or you might ever find yourself in. But if Joseph could thrive in his work environment, then maybe so can you. Okay? If Joseph could thrive in his exilic work environment, then so can you. He literally climbed the corporate ladder while he was enslaved in exile. But there's a reason why this occurred, and we cannot miss this verse, okay? It was in verse 2 when it says, Joseph succeeded in everything he did because the Lord was with Joseph. It was all because of the Lord's blessing Joseph's hands and the work he did that brought that much success to Potiphar's household. Joseph was successful in exile because God was with him in his work. But what does that mean? Okay? Did that mean just, God magically made everything Joseph touched clean? He just had to sit back and God's Holy Spirit just clean the floors for him? Did God magically blessing Joseph's work mean that he never had to have a disciplinary conversation with the other slaves that worked under him? because they just knew exactly what he wanted? Like what would the equivalent be if God's favor were on us in our workplaces? Does that mean that like we would just magically sell more cars? You know? Or that the team members who serve under us just automatically know our expectations and they just did everything exactly to the T of what we wanted? Right? Would it mean that we could just show up to work and coast because God just makes everything happen so you are fully justified to continue scrolling on TikTok during your work hours? You've done it. We've done it, you know? No. That is not what this means. That is not what this means. Here's what this does mean from Joseph's story, okay? You ready for this? This is coming on the screen so you can take notes because this is really important, all right? Being a good worker is evidence that God's Spirit dwells in you. Being a good worker is evidence that God's Spirit dwells in you. No verse gets at this better than Colossians 3:23 through 24 when it tells us to work willingly in whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward and that the master you are serving is Christ. God didn't magically make Joseph a good worker. Joseph was a good worker because God was with him. It didn't matter that he was in a foreign land enslaved to a high-ranking Egyptian official surrounded by all sorts of paganism and contradiction to his own faith. He worked as if God was his boss, not Potiphar. And his work ethic turned heads. Right? You see, here's the deal. Even if you're in a secular work environment, or you're attending a secular college, or even if you're a stay-at-home mom, right? Or you are constantly working from home, the temptation is to feel like we have to run away, right? Like we have to just go and kind of get into corners with all of our Christian friends. You know, we have this amazing community center, and it might be easy to want to go and hang out there or all these other places and try to escape the culture that we're in. But that is so far from what God wants us to do. Like we need to have these safe spaces to cultivate our faith, but we still need to get involved in these places because they need to hear the gospel. Amen? And what places do we spend the most of our waking hours in? Our vocations, our jobs, our classes, right? And we have to work hard in those areas. We can rise up and influence, right? When we view ourselves as God's co-laborers, where everything we do is working for Him, then all of our work can be an effort to make the world a better place and to tell others about His goodness. And here's the reality. This is also so important. Don't view your career as a way to make a living. View your career as a way to make a difference. Don't view your career as a way to make a living. View your career as a way to make a difference, right? Your work matters. Whether you're a CEO of your business, a chiropractor, a fast food worker, a student, or a stay-at-home mom, your work is not to make a living. It is to make a difference. And it's perhaps the number one way where you could influence others with your relationship with God. Again, it's where we spend the most of our time. It's where we spend the most of our time. I remember when we had a guy come out to help install a new shower in our home. Literally, our bathtub was sinking into the floor. It was very bad. So this guy came. He's doing us a huge favor, right? And we got to chatting a little bit before he started working on our shower, and I mentioned that I'm a pastor here in town. And he just lit up at that. He's like, oh, no way. I'm a follower of Jesus too. And he went on to explain how he uses his job at installing showers as a chance to try to just shed God's light and share about the gospel when the opportunities present themselves. And he also did a great job installing that shower, right? Which is awesome. Another story, I gave Zeke a heads up. I'm going to brag on Zeke here for a second. Zeke Matta, he's one of our students here. I'll never forget, like, you still work at Mr. Smith's? Or you did? Yeah, so Zeke makes sandwiches for a living. But one of the things that he told me a while ago is that he views his work as if he's making sandwiches for God. And how he approaches his work ethic and how he is really efficient with what he's doing, whether, that's cutting the salami or I don't know what you do, but, or toasting the bread, or even just working with customers and working with his employees, his manager noticed. And the other people noticed. And it turned heads. And it boosted culture. not because he just loved making sandwiches, but because he viewed it as working for the Lord. You see how different that is? When you can actually live out a good work ethic in what you're doing, we completely underestimate the ability of how that communicates God's goodness to people, right? Because you know what's a really quick way to thwart our influence on others in our work environments as Christians? Being lazy. Imagine for a second, you're at work, right? You have the Christian bumper stickers, you wear the shirts, you have the necklaces, right? People know you. You even have a little knick-knack from Hobby Lobby that has your favorite verse on it, at your desk, okay? And your workplace knows you're a Christian, and you even invite them to church. But what do you think that those non-believers would think of you if you show up and you scroll every day on social media, you're not professional, you don't get stuff done, and you just don't do a good job with your job? How do you think that's going to rub off on them? How do you think they're going to view you? And all of a sudden, your influence there in your vocation just, it's donezo. Right? Our faith is meant to be integrated between Sundays here in church and Mondays in the office or wherever you go, or the classroom. It's so vital. So perhaps we need to stop viewing our workplace as our exiles and start viewing our workplace as our mission field, where we can truly make a difference. To give it your all. Because if God is with you, then how you work and go about your job should show for it. Amen? All right. Now, here's a really important part when it comes to having a faith that thrives in an exilic work environment, okay? And it's that God's Spirit shouldn't just influence your work ethic. He also should influence your ethics at work, okay? So not only should you be a godly worker in your work environments, you should also be a godly person. And what that means is if you're standing for higher values, if you are standing for the ways of God and for his ethics, yeah, that might turn some heads, that might even give you promotions like Joseph, but it could also get you in trouble and maybe even fired or maybe even imprisoned in the case of Joseph. Let's continue on in reading his story in Genesis 39, starting in verse 6. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. We all have those one coworkers, right, where we try to avoid at all costs. It's apparently what Joseph's doing here. One day, however, no one else was around when he went to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants, and soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. And then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Here's the thing. If Joseph gave in to Potiphar's wife's request, he probably would have kept his job. Things would have gone on as normal, as long as Potiphar didn't find out, unless, the camera happened to capture him at a Coldplay concert and just put it up on a Megatron, right? We all know what if you know, you know. But Joseph stood for something higher. He didn't just have a godly work ethic, he stood for godly ethics in his work. He wasn't just a good worker, he was a good person. And unfortunately, in exilic work environments, doing the right thing, following God's ways, could get you in trouble. Oh man, a story I have to share is of one of my mentors. When I attended Indiana Wesleyan University to study for ministry, Eddie Shigley was the guy who directed our program. He mentored me, was just an amazing influence in my life during those years. But before he came to Indiana Wesleyan University, he worked at our sister university called Oklahoma Wesleyan University, or OKWU for short. You know, and these Wesleyan universities are Christian universities, right? They're private, independent Christian universities. So you would think that like everyone there would work for good, godly Christian ethics, right? And especially that the president of said private Christian universities would stand for good, godly Christian ethics, right? Right? Well, wrong. Because it turns out the president often had a number of different malpractices that he would do behind closed doors. And Eddie, being the vice president of student life at that point, worked very closely with the president. And he always found himself in this debacle of trying to represent the president despite knowing all these other things he's doing that was wrong. And he knew the chances were good that he could get in trouble if he were to bring that up and to talk with him. And so he was going back and forth, and he was processing with his wife about this, as every good man should do. And he says he will never forget Esther's response when she just looked at him and said, "Eddie, if you don't go to talk to him, I will lose all respect for you." Needless to say, he had the conversation, right? He approached the president, talked about all the malpractices he saw, and got fired on the spot. You should by all means give your work your all, but you should not compromise your position before God for a position at your work. You should not compromise your position before God for a position at your work. You should not compromise your position before God for a position at your work. While Joseph was tempted time and time and time again by Potiphar's wife, he wasn't willing to compromise his own life and his own morals. Working in exile means you stand for something higher than those around you, and they will not understand it. They will berate you for it. They will give you a hard time for it. They might even fire you because of it. But that shouldn't scare us. Because why would God just all of a sudden abandon us in that exile for us following his ways? He's going to see us through it. And that's exactly what continues on in Joseph's story. So let's continue to read what happens with him in Genesis 39, verses 19 through 23. Let's start back at 19 to see what happens. So Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Okay, so just when you think things couldn't get worse for Joseph, I mean, he had everything stripped from him the first time, and then he rose up the corporate ladder, and then he got everything stripped from him again, only for him to rise up the corporate ladder in prison, right? Like, this man's a monster, or at least supremely blessed by God and faithful to his ways. He still gave it his all. God was still with him, and he was still with God. And Joseph did not abandon his faith despite being put in prison, which was kind of, the complete opposite of rising to this huge political authority figure that he dreamed about all those years ago. If Joseph can thrive while in prison, perhaps you can thrive in your exilic work environment. And I mean, I have no doubt that it was still hard. I mean, thriving doesn't mean comfortability. It doesn't mean life was easy. It just means you make the best of what God has given to you and to see him through. Now, I do want to clarify, Maybe there are some of you here who are working in such a toxic work environment, such a hard place, that it's getting to the point where it is wearing down on you. You are depressed, you are anxious, you are completely overburdened, and you are certainly not godly. Like when we spend the most of our time here in our workplaces, it can wear us down. And if it ever gets to a point where it's constantly having us compromise on who we're called to be for our family, let alone for followers of Jesus, then there absolutely is a season where we need to discern if we need to step out of that, if we need to find something else that is going to better, steward what God is calling us to do, okay? That should not be taken lightly. Seek coaching, seek help in how to take those next steps forward, okay? So I want to give that caveat, all right? So I'm not telling you to stay in a toxic work environment, okay? Especially, if it's going to compromise on God's ways for your life. But maybe there are some of us here who need this next point, though, okay? Maybe you don't need to change your job, but you just need to change your mindset. Because what if you're the one who's toxic? What if it's your mindset, your toxic mindset, that's coloring everything around you, painting it in a worse picture or a worse light than what it actually is? What if you're the one who's dragging down other people, What if it's you who's dragging down the culture there? And if that's the case, maybe that's where you need to go back up and see, all right, does God have me here for a mission field? Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's more manageable. Perhaps I could try to be a better worker. Perhaps I could have better work ethics at work, right? Maybe all you need is a mindset change, not a job change. Worked pretty well for Joseph, so maybe it could work for you too. All right, let's tie a bow on this. I'm going to have Mason come back up here as we begin to close up shop here. So let's see how Joseph's story fully comes to an end, though. All right. It doesn't end in prison. He was there for 2 full years. Okay, and then through a bunch of other crazy situations that you'll need to read the story in your own time. The Pharaoh hears about Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, and invites Joseph to come and interpret a very troubling dream that the Pharaoh had. And he was so successful in interpreting this dream of, the future 7 years of plenty that Egypt will see, that will then be able to store up all those goods to then provide for the 7 years. And the Pharaoh was famine for 7 years in the ancient Near East. And the Pharaoh was so blown away that he made Joseph second in command over all of Egypt. Where the only other person who was higher in him in rank was Pharaoh. And this happened 13 years after God originally gave him the dream at 17. He was 30. I don't know what your dreams are for your life. I don't know what your career aspirations are. Forget career. I don't know what your life is like, the hardships you face, or you feel like the promises that God has given you and the lack of seeing those fulfilled are. We can groan about how hard things aren't, like, they're not clearly what they're supposed to be, but perhaps we need to lean more so into, where does God have you now? Where is he calling you now? How can you lean in? How can you be faithful with what he has given you, the job he has given you, the classes he has given you, the peers he has given you, your kids that he has given you? What if in all of our aspirations of, God, what do you have for my life? What's next? What if it's just right where you're at? Make the best right where you're at. I'm right there with you. And if we give it our all, that's pretty good evidence that God's Spirit is dwelling among us. Amen? Perhaps when we do so, it might even transform some other people's lives in the midst of it. Would you stand with me? Let's continue on in worship.